In the chaos of World War II, with cities burning and armies shattered, one soldier stood apart, not for bravery alone, but for his sheer impossibility. He walked on four paws. He ate jam straight from the jar. He rustled grown men for fun. And on the slopes of Monte Cassino, under thundering enemy fire, he carried 100-pound artillery shells in his arms like toys. This is the almost unbelievable true story of Wojtek, the bear who became a soldier of the Polish Second Corps. This is the story of an orphaned brown bear who became a brother-in-arms to exiled soldiers, a creature who marched, trained, lived, and fought beside men who had lost their nation but not their spirit. It is the story of Wojtek, the soldier bear of Poland, whose journey from a frightened cub in the mountains of Persia to a uniformed artillery handler in Italy stands as one of the most unbelievable true tales of the Second World War. We bring you real and true World War II stories that are never heard before. Watch till the end and subscribe for true and unique WW2 stories. The year was 1939. Europe trembled under the weight of armies in motion. On the 1st of September at dawn, the German Wehrmacht surged across the Polish border with tanks, aircraft, and precision-planned brutality. And from the east, a few weeks later, the Soviet Red Army advanced, cutting Poland in half. As the world watched in horror, a nation that had fought for centuries to exist was carved apart once more. Millions of civilians were displaced. Soldiers who attempted resistance were overwhelmed by the unstoppable pincer of two empires. Polish officers and intellectuals vanished into the Siberian gloom of labor camps. Families were dragged from their homes and transported across thousands of frozen kilometers. Through railroads, cattle cars, and guarded marches, entire communities dissolved into the vastness of the Soviet interior. Yet despite this calamity, a seed of resistance remained. Among those captured and imprisoned in the Soviet Union were the soldiers who would one day form the Polish Second Corps, the very men who would later raise a small bear cub as one of their own. They survived winters of starvation and camps of brutal labor, clinging not just to life, but to the memory of a homeland stolen from them. Their story intersected with Wojtek's long before they met, for in the harsh currents of war, the lives of man and bear were already drifting toward one another. In 1941, the winds of war shifted unpredictably. Hitler, once an uneasy ally of Stalin, launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion the world had ever seen, turning the Soviet Union into a desperate, newly minted member of the Allied coalition. One of the political consequences of this shift was the release of thousands of Polish prisoners from Soviet captivity. Thin, exhausted, and traumatized, these survivors were permitted to form a Polish army on Soviet soil, an army that would soon march across Central Asia and train under British command. History would remember them as Anders' Army, named after General Władysław Anders, himself recently freed from the infamous Lubyanka prison. Their route southward took them through Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and into Persia, modern-day Iran, where British supply lines and military camps offered food, coordination, and eventual passage to the Middle East. By the spring of 1942, the columns of Polish soldiers, once broken and hopeless, began to feel human again. Their bellies were fuller, their clothing was cleaner, and a sense of purpose slowly returned. Yet they were also a wounded force, carrying invisible scars of betrayal, exile, and loss. They needed something, anything, that could remind them there was still warmth in the world. And that reminder arrived on four paws. It happened somewhere in the rugged hills between Hamadan and Tehran. The exact point is lost to time, but every veteran who witnessed it agreed on the image. A young shepherd boy, dusty and afraid,
approached the Polish convoy carrying a burlap sack that moved. Inside was a Syrian brown bear cub, no more than a few months old, orphaned, hungry, and clinging to life. The soldiers were immediately drawn to the small creature. These were men who had watched their families torn apart, their comrades disappear, and their homeland shattered. The sight of something innocent, something vulnerable, awoke something long dormant within them. Using a few tins of food and some military rations, they gently fed the cub. He clawed eagerly at bread, condensed milk, and fruit. In minutes, he transformed from fearful to trusting, as though sensing he had found protectors. The soldiers purchased the cub from the shepherd boy, partly out of pity, partly out of curiosity. With no mother and no chance of survival in the wild, the little creature needed them as much as they needed him. They named him Wojtek, a diminutive of Wojciech, meaning joyful warrior in Polish. It was a name he would live up to in ways nobody could have imagined.
Life in the Persian transit camps was chaotic. Refugees, soldiers, and medical units moved constantly. Supplies passed from British trucks to Polish divisions. Training fields echoed with shouted orders and the rhythmic thud of marching boots. But amid this military bustle, a strange new routine emerged, one centered entirely around the growing bear cub. Wojtek quickly became the unofficial mascot of the Polish Second Corps. His caretakers built him a makeshift bed from old blankets. They bottle-fed him with diluted milk, often holding him like an oversized infant. At night, he sometimes crawled into their tents, curling up for warmth against their fatigued bodies. In a landscape defined by loss and displacement, Wojtek became a symbol of innocence, a reminder that not everything had been consumed by war. The bear learned to walk on his hind legs, to climb into trucks, to wrestle playfully with soldiers, and to understand basic hand gestures. He developed a taste for fruit, honey, and, famously, beer. Soldiers laughed as the cub tried to drink from bottles, often spilling more than he swallowed. But the bear was not a mere novelty. He became a companion, a morale booster, and, in time, an integral part of the daily life of the Second Corps. He followed marching troops, sat beside trenches, and observed artillery drills with curious fascination. Far from being a distraction, he became their tether to humanity. The men believed that as long as the bear was with them, fate had not completely abandoned them. By late 1942, the Polish Second Corps left Persia and traveled across Iraq, Syria, and Palestine for further training under British command. These journeys were long, dusty, and often grueling, but Wojtek remained unfazed. He tolerated the heat far better than the men, often sitting on top of supply trucks, his fur rippling in the wind as if he were a king surveying his domain. In Iraq, he learned to swim in the Tigris River, splashing playfully with soldiers who laughed for the first time in years. In Palestine, he became a favorite of local laborers who stared in disbelief as a uniformed column marched with a bear strolling casually beside them. In Egypt, he wandered the dunes near Alexandria, occasionally startling British officers who assumed they were hallucinating from the heat. At every stop, Wojtek grew, physically and in reputation. By 1943, he was no longer a cub. He was enormous, powerful muscles flowing beneath thick brown fur, claws like curved blades, and a presence that commanded immediate respect. Yet he remained gentle with the men who had raised him, often lounging in the shade beside their tents, nuzzling their hands, and wrestling with them in bouts that always ended with the human pinned but unharmed. The soldiers loved him. The officers tolerated him. And the British, bewildered and amused, allowed him to remain, because they had never seen such loyalty in an animal. The Polish Second Corps was preparing for active deployment. The bear would deploy with them. The destination was Italy, a land torn by fierce battles between Allied forces and German divisions entrenched in mountain fortresses. But there was a problem. Regulations stated that animals, especially large, potentially dangerous ones, were not allowed on troop transports or within combat zones. The Polish Second Corps offered a simple solution. If animals were not allowed, then Wojtek would not be classified as an animal. He would be enlisted, officially, with a rank. That decision created one of the most surreal military records of the war. Wojtek was given a service number, a pay book, and the rank of private. He became part of the 22nd Artillery Supply Company, complete with a line in the company's formal roster. With this bureaucratic miracle solved, Wojtek boarded the ship to Italy, not as cargo, but as a soldier. As the vessel crossed the Mediterranean, he wandered its decks, entertaining troops, calming nerves, and lifting spirits that had been battered by years of hardship. Ahead of him lay the greatest challenge of his life. Italy's geography, a jagged spine of mountains running from north to south, favored defenders. German forces used every ridge, valley, and hillside to create deadly fortified lines. The most famous of these was the Gustav Line, anchored by the ancient monastery of Monte Cassino. The Allied push stalled under relentless machine gun nests, minefields, artillery, and expertly camouflaged defenses. Attempts to break the line resulted in massive casualties. By early 1944, the task of taking Monte Cassino fell partly to the Polish Second Corps. The soldiers who had marched from Siberia to Persia now faced one of the bloodiest battles of the entire war. It was in this crucible that Wojtek would make history. The slopes of Monte Cassino were a nightmare. Steep, rocky, and exposed, they offered almost no cover. German positions above rained mortar fire and machine gun bursts onto every advancing unit. The terrain was so difficult that even mules struggled to carry supplies. Artillery shells, the lifeblood of any assault, had to be transported manually, crate by crate, up unforgiving mountain paths. Soldiers carried 25-kilogram rounds on their backs, stumbling under their weight. And then one day, as artillery crews scrambled to move ammunition under fire, something remarkable happened. Wojtek watched the men struggling. He saw them lifting crates. He saw them loading shells. He saw them moving with purpose. So he stood up on his hind legs. He approached a crate. He wrapped his massive arms around it, and he lifted. At first, the soldiers froze, uncertain whether the bear was helping or causing chaos. But as Wojtek carried the crate toward the artillery line with deliberate, careful steps, they erupted in disbelief. Here was a bear, under active fire, carrying ammunition like a trained loader. He worked tirelessly. He followed the men, mimicking their actions, lifting heavy shells with astonishing precision. The noise, the smoke, the explosions, none of it deterred him. If anything, he was energized by the sense of shared purpose. Throughout the assault, Wojtek helped keep the guns supplied. His efforts ensured that artillery support never faltered. And when Monte Cassino was finally taken, after tremendous sacrifice, the men of the Second Corps knew that their furry comrade had played a real, tangible role in the victory. His legend was sealed. Wojtek's bravery at Monte Cassino inspired the formal adoption of a new insignia for the 22nd Artillery Supply Company. It depicted a bear carrying an artillery shell. This was not symbolic. It was literal. It represented exactly what the soldiers had witnessed. Every soldier in the company wore this emblem proudly on their uniforms. It became part of their identity, a reminder that bravery comes in many forms, and sometimes from the most unexpected places. Wojtek, now widely respected and recognized, became a soldier not just on paper, but in the eyes of commanders, allies, and even hardened veterans who had fought since the war's earliest days. He was given more responsibility,
more freedom, and even participated in military parades, standing upright beside the men who marched with him. He had become part of their family. By 1945, the war in Europe drew to a violent close. Germany collapsed under the weight of advancing Allied armies from the west and the unstoppable tide of Soviet forces from the east. For the Polish Second Corps, victory was bittersweet. They had fought courageously in Africa, in Italy, in dozens of forgotten engagements. But their homeland had fallen under Soviet control. Many would never see Poland again. As troops were demobilized and assigned to post-war camps, the question arose.
What would become of Wojtek? He could not return to Poland. He could not be released into the wild. And to send him to a zoo in a foreign land felt like a betrayal of everything he had become. But there was no alternative. Wojtek was transferred to the Edinburgh Zoo in Scotland, a place that promised safety, care, and respect. Yet, his departure was a moment of heartbreak. Veterans wept openly as they hugged him for the last time. Some whispered final farewells in Polish. Others sat quietly beside him, hands resting on his fur, remembering the long, painful journey they had shared. For Wojtek, the separation was confusing. He searched for familiar faces among the crowds. He waited for the sound of artillery drills, for the laughter of soldiers, for the rough but affectionate pats on his shoulders. But those sounds were gone. A new chapter had begun. In the years that followed, Wojtek became a local celebrity in Edinburgh. Visitors marveled at the enormous bear who saluted soldiers, accepted cigarettes, and perked up whenever he heard Polish spoken near his enclosure. Veterans of the Second Corps visited him regularly, bringing treats, sharing memories, and sometimes climbing into the enclosure to embrace their old friend. Zoo staff, respecting the deep bond between man and bear, allowed these extraordinary reunions. To the end of his life, Wojtek responded to Polish commands, stood at attention when he saw uniforms, and displayed unmistakable joy whenever he recognized the men who had raised him. He never forgot them. They never forgot him. Wojtek lived until 1963, passing away at the age of 21, elderly for a bear of his species. But his legacy endures far beyond his years. Statues stand in his honor in Poland, Scotland, and Italy. Museums carry his photographs. His paw print appears in military archives. His story is told in classrooms, documentaries, books, and memorial ceremonies. He remains an enduring symbol of the Polish wartime experience, the resilience of exiles, the bond forged in hardship, and the hope that survived even the brutality of the 20th century. His life reminds us that in the midst of chaos, something profoundly human can emerge from the unlikeliest of places. A bear became a soldier. A refugee army found a friend, and together they marched through one of history's darkest chapters, leaving behind a story that continues to inspire decades later. Wojtek was not a myth, not a legend, not a fantasy. He was real. And he was one of the most extraordinary soldiers of the Second World War. Thanks for watching. We bring you real and true World War II stories that are never heard before. Subscribe for true and unique World War II stories.